Good morning, and thank you for joining this online virtual service of the First Unitarian Church of Alton on this 13th day of June 2021. I am Joy Heft, and I serve as a worship associate, and am also the pianist for this church. We are a small lay-led congregation located in Alton, Illinois, on the bluffs of the Mississippi River. Due to the pandemic, our services are now virtual. Past and present services can be located on our church YouTube channel. We hope to see you at our castle on the hill sometime soon when we can return to worship face-to-face. In the meantime, we welcome everyone to this virtual home of comfort, spirit, justice, and hope. We are Unitarian Universalists. Last month, we heard about the people who influenced Universalism from the 18th to the 20th centuries. Today we will learn about the merger of the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America in the mid-20th century, and the events and the people who were influential in bringing the faith to what it is today in the 21st century. We begin our service with a prelude. If you have a candle nearby, please join me as I light my own and recite these unison words for lighting our chalice. We kindle this light in celebration for the life that we share. In time for our offering, we offer the gentle reminder that this community of faith is supported only by your giving, both in time and financially. We need each other, and in times of trial, we need each other even more. You can mail your gifts to the First Unitarian Church, Post Office Box 494, Alton, Illinois 62002. Or you can give electronically by searching for the First Unitarian Church of Alton on the Giblify app or via the link on our webpage. You can also give through PayPal if you prefer. Give what you will, for you are a generous people. If you know it, please join me in our offering prayer. May this offering equip us to inspire love and seek justice. Please join me in singing our first hymn, titled If I'm a Unitarian Universalist, from the Unitarian Universalist Musician Network Songbook. The music is by Betsy S. Roman, and the lyrics were contributed by the children of the Unitarian Community Church of Santa Monica, California. The song will be played through once. We have 3 readings today. Our first reading is by William Schultz, UUA President. This is the mission of our faith, to teach the fragile art of hospitality, to revere both critical mind and the generous heart, to prove that diversity need not mean divisiveness, and to witness to all that we must hold whole world in our hands. Our second reading is from Lifting Our Voices, Readings in the Living Tradition, by William G. Skinner, UUA President. We are a gentle and generous people, but let us not forget our anger. May it fuel not only our commitment to compassion, but also our commitment to make fundamental changes. Our vision of the beloved community must stand against a vision that would allow the privilege of the few to be accepted as just and even holy. Our religious vision must again and again ask, who is my neighbor? And strive always to include more and more of us. As we intone the words that gave birth to this nation, we the people, we are, and we should be, both a gentle and an angry people. Our final reading today is by John A. Burens, UUA President, along with Rebecca Parker from Lifting Our Voices, Reading in the Living Tradition. Hope rises. It rises from the heart of life here and now, beating with joy and sorrow. Hope longs. It longs for good to be affirmed, for justice and love to prevail, for suffering to be alleviated, and for life to flourish in peace. Hope remembers. It remembers the dreams of those who have gone before and reaches for connection with them across the boundary of death. Hope acts. It acts to bless, to protect, and to repair. The past few months, we have heard about the people who influenced Unitarianism and Universalism. Today, we will conclude this series to talk about the merger of the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America. Since the middle 1800s, there have been several attempts to merge the Unitarians and the Universalist churches. In 1908, the National Federation of Religious Liberals was formed. Its members include the Unitarians, Universalists, Religious Society of Friends, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis. This group ceased in the 1930s with the development of the Free Church of America. In 1935, the American Unitarian Association, the AUA, and the Universalist Church of America, the UCA, approved a union between the two organizations, but was defeated and turned down by the Universalist General Conference. In 1947, at the AUA conference, again a motion was passed to form a union with the UCA. This motion was again taken up at the UCA business meeting, and this time it was approved, thus starting the beginning of the transition to form a joint association. By 1961, both denominations suffered a steady decline in membership during the post-war period. This led to the two organizations finally merging into one, becoming the Unitarian Universalist Association. The UUA comprised mostly of non-Christian churches, many of which had been organized 50 to 75 years before 1960. The Unitarian Universalist Association, after 1960 to the present. I decided to introduce all the presidents of the Unitarian Universalist Association from the merger to the 21st century, discussing some of the things they were known for doing and the events that led to our denomination forward. Reverend Dana McLean Greeley was a Unitarian minister, the last president of the American Unitarian Association, and upon its merger, was a founding president of the Unitarian Universalist Association from 1961 to 1969. He assisted in creating the set of 6 principles and purposes for the newly merged Unitarian Universalist Association, which were adopted in 1960. Here were the original 6 principles and purposes. Principles of a free faith unite in seeking, to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship, to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age tradition, immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man, to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relations, to implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community founded on ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace, to serve the need of member churches and fellowships, and to extend and strengthen liberal religion, to encourage cooperation with men of goodwill in every land. There is a heated debate surrounding the wording of these statements that nearly derailed the 2 denominations coming together the year before. The contention revolved around whether to include such phrases as love to God and love to man, and a reference to our Judeo-Christian heritage. The compromise version included a critical change from our heritage to the heritage in an all-night parliamentary negotiation and debate. The UUA president of the newly formed association, Greeley, put together a commission to pile a new hymn book, and Kenneth Patton was an obvious choice to be put on the Hymnbook Commission. The new hymnal came out in 1964 and was titled Hymns for a Celebration of Life. It included old hymn tunes that came to new life with new words, such as We Are the Earth Upright and Proud, which we sang last week, and was set to Ein Festberg. And Brief Our Days But Long for Singing was set to the melody of Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. Reverend Robert Nelson West was a Unitarian Universalist minister and the 2nd president of the UUA from 1969 to 1977. West was a soft-spoken, somewhat introverted, and a painfully honest man who became a community leader and a civil rights activist. Someone had described him as the Jimmy Carter of Unitarian Universalists. In 1969, West rescued the association from bankruptcy and then reshaped its internal structure and eventually increased outside funding in which he assured would have a reliable economic base. West's other innovations included setting up the Church of the Larger Fellowship as an independent congregation, creating the offices of Gay Concerns, publishing the first UUA curriculum kit on human sexuality, pioneering a, quote, About Your Sexuality program. He was also able to increase support for Star King School for the ministry. 2 shocks jolted the UUA soon after its formation. Both were related to the struggle for racial justice, but one unified the denomination and the other shattered the assumption of a unified self-image of being on the right side of the struggle. 4 years after the murder of James Reeb, many black delegates and their white supporters walked out of the General Assembly in Boston to protest what they considered a racist vote. Suddenly, in the fight for racial justice, the us, or good guys, versus them, the racists, suddenly wasn't so clear. Unitarians and Universalists had been fighting for racial justice long before 1965, as many ministers of both denominations signed separate anti-slavery declarations. The Black Panthers and police violence made headlines, as well as racial rioting, which left 66 dead months before King was assassinated. After 1967, the Reverend Homer Jack, the director of the UUA Department of Social Responsibility, called for an emergency conference on the Unitarian Universalist response to the Black Rebellion. Some 135 participants, including 37 African Americans, gathered at New York's Biltmore Hotel. Shortly after the meeting was called to order, at the suggestion of some black members of the Los Angeles Church, 30 of the 37 African American delegates withdrew to form a Black Unitarian Universalist caucus. They developed a list of what they called, quote, non-negotiable demands to be submitted to the conference and the UU Board of Trustees. The core demand was that the board establish a Black Affairs Council to be appointed by the Black UU Caucus and funded for 4 years at $250,000 a year. These funds would go for grants to fight political repression and economic exploitation in the Black community, and to support Black culture, expressions, and community education. In addition, the proposed group would allow members to explore their identities as Black UUs. The conference accepted these terms of the Black Caucus, though some participants left in protest of them. A split among Black UUs soon threatened to tear apart the denomination. President West ended up funding the Black Affairs Council, but not the Black and White Association. This further deepened the rift between African Americans and the Unitarian Universalists. In 1968, Hayward Henry, the chair of the newly formed Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus, was wondering why the Black people were rejecting our faith as we were there supporting them during the civil rights actions. Perhaps we seem to forget, even with all our civil rights activism, our congregations remained overwhelmingly white, and only a handful of African Americans had ever been ordained as UU ministers. Throughout the 1960s, the civil rights agenda had moved forwards towarding Black empowerment. West's other contribution to the UUA that has made a deep impact in today has been his decision to change the subscription-based UUA Now magazine, which had a minimal circulation, and replace it with a free newspaper, the Unitarian Universalist World, which was launched in March of 1970. It went to more than 110,000 families. Not only would this service to keep everyone informed of the major denominational developments, it would also help to create a sense of belonging, a sense of UU identity. In 1971, West authorized the denomination's Beacon Press to publish the Pentagon Papers, which detailed the American government's role in the Vietnam War. When excerpts of the paper were leaked to the newspapers, Nixon used every tactic, legal and illegal, to suppress the publication, forming the infamous team of, quote, plumbers to track down the leak. These tactics eventually triggered the Watergate scandal and an investigation by the FBI, and an extensive legal battle between the UUA and the White House began, which eventually drove Nixon out of office, and the UUA became the target of Nixon's fury. Publishing the Pentagon Papers was an expensive but necessary undertaking, for as West had told the court, quote, at the core of the Unitarian and Universalist religion are freedom of conscience, individual freedom of belief, and the application of one's religion in the daily action of public and private nature, end quote. Also in 1971, a Long Island church, now the UU Congregation at Shelter Rock in Manhasset, New York, helped restore the UUA's finances with major loans and grants from the bequests of Carolin Veach. Later, the Veach program set up a $20 million endowment fund for the UUA in 1985. This program continues to support the UUA and other UUA organizations' social justice programs with grants every year. When the UUA was founded, their hope was that membership would soar. But 10 years later, after congregants started sending in their mailing lists for the launch of the UU World, there had been no reliable figures to compare optimistic reports of growth. There were other losses too. Between 1961 and 1983, 315 congregations died, and many lost members. Many more conservative members left in part due to the wide anti-war sentiment activists of many ministers and congregations. The radical controversy led some people on both sides to leave. Over many years, women and some men had been unhappy with the blatant sexist language of the original bylaws, including a reference to the dignity of man. During the 1970s, when the U.S. women's movement was gathering momentum, they found this sexist language offensive and insisted that the terminology be changed. In 1977, the UUWF, the UU Women's Federation, put forward a resolution to change the terminology, to make an effort to put traditional assumptions and language in perspective, and to avoid sexist assumptions and language in the future. That same year, the General Assembly adopted the Women in Religion Resolution, pledging to change sexist language, assumptions, and practices. In 1981, a non-sexist revision of the provisions of the Principles and Purposes, drafted by various women's groups, was presented to the General Assembly, which eliminated the word God. This caused an uneasiness to the UU Christians, and they saw it as writing them out of the UUA. In 1977, only 5% of UU clergy were women. Today, more than 50% of UU ministers are women. The women's rights movement, the campaign to pass equal rights, and the new feminism reached congregations with power. The Women's Caucus was founded at the Arlington Street Unitarian Church in Boston, Massachusetts in 1971. Led by Carolin McDade and the caucus singers, who were a raft of talented women songwriters, singers, and musicians. They wrote and sang songs about the equal rights of women. After a disappointing Mother's Day service, and realizing how unconcerned their minister was in their feelings, the caucus members demanded that another Sunday service of its own should be dedicated to women. The opening song for that service was called, "Well, We Might Come In A-Fighting" by Carolin McDade. Can you picture 20 caucus women bursting into the sanctuary with pithy signs on their back with the words "bitch" across them, and them singing this song? In support for women's rights, please join me in singing this song, "Well, We Might Come In A-Fighting" by Carolin McDade. The chorus will play once through. Paul Nathaniel Carnes was a longtime minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Buffalo, New York. He served as UU president from 1977 to 1979. In 1964, Paul marched for civil rights with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, Alabama. He helped form the Interracial and Interdenominational Ministers Association, and he and other members of the group rode buses in Buffalo to calm racial tensions after a student had been stabbed on the bus. In 1959, Paul was a strong believer that the Unitarians and Universalists should unite, and Carnes has applied for and received reciprocal fellowship with the Universalist Church of America. During his short presidency, Paul was a proponent of desegregation and civil liberties. He reinstated the Department of Social Responsibility at the Unitarian Universalist Association to work on issues of racial equality and worked to establish affirmation action for women and minorities in ministry. In 1964, he became vice president of the Niagara Frontier branch of the American Civil Liberties Union. Carnes was diagnosed with lymphoma and treated by chemotherapy in 1963. His illness did not keep him from continuing with his life's work, although it dissuaded him from running from the UUA presidency in 1968, and instead he managed Robert West's successful election campaign. With his cancer in remission in 1977, he was elected as the third president of the UUA. At the beginning of his term, he wished that the liberal church would be able to, quote, give men and women, in whatever urgent demand that inspired imagination and hope, to make amid a sea of change the open mind and courageous heart abiding realities. Paul Carnes' UU presidency was cut short in 1978 with the sudden return of his cancer. His strength was limited, and he was unable to meet his responsibilities of this position. He died in his home in Boston in 1979. Reverend Eugene Pickett took over as UU president after the death of Paul Carnes. He was president from 1979 to 1985. Pickett completed the first capital campaign of the UUA. He also facilitated the rewriting of the UU principles, which were in need of modernizing. During Pickett's tenure as president, membership in UU churches began to grow after a decade of decline. Despite one denomination, by 1979 there was still some confusion as to what word we have to spread. The old watchwords of liberalism, freedom, reason, tolerance were not catching the imaginations of the contemporary world, and they were not deep enough or intimate enough by themselves. The original statement of the purposes of the UUA, which includes 6 principles and purposes, adopted in 1960, as the two organizations were consolidating, no longer served the need. In 1984, it was somewhat of an amazement that the principles and purposes that replaced the original wording were adopted nearly unanimously at the next General Assembly, and have lasted virtually unchanged for the next 15 years. The principles weren't meant to be dogma or doctrine, but rather a guide for those of us who choose to join and participate in Unitarian Universalist religious communities. The covenant of the member congregations of the UUA principles and purposes as adopted in 1985, with 7 principles and 5 sources added at the time. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. The 5 sources were also added in 1985. The living tradition which we share draws from many sources. Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Words and deeds of prophetic women and men which challenge us to confront powers and structure of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. Wisdom from the world's religions, which inspire us in our ethical and spiritual life. Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the result of science, and ward us against the idolatries of the mind and spirit. One of the most important examples that the principles and purposes demonstrate is that it has guided the development of the denominational religious education program that both express and nurtures UU's sense of identity, along with curricula such as Around the Church, Around the Year, and for the youngest, Being a UU Parent. Please enjoy this video of the UU Principles song by Reverend Tony Larson, sung by Steve Askins.
I believe in every person's worth and dignity, in justice and compassion. I believe in equity, acceptance of each other, encouragement to grow, a free and open search for truth to find the way to go, affirm the right of conscience and affirm democracy. Goal of world community with peace and liberty. Respect the web of nature of which we are a part. These are UU principles I hold close to my heart.
The Flaming Chalice, introduced by Unitarian Universalist Service Committee during World War II, was first used as a denominational logo in 1976. It becomes a ritual part of many worship services in the 1980s, such as lighting the chalice at the beginning of worship services. The Flaming Chalice has become a reverent symbol in our churches today and was first used by the Unitarian Service Committee in World War II. The flame is among the oldest of religious symbols, and the chalice has been associated with the communion since the early centuries of Christianity. The unique combination of these items, fire and a drinking vessel, were the invention of the artist Hans Deutsch in 1941. It was commissioned during World War II as a symbol of the Unitarian Service Committee. Reverend Dr. Charles Ryan Joy, Commissioner for Europe of the newly founded Unitarian Service Committee, was instrumental in the Flaming Chalice's creation. He directed the Lisbon, Portugal office, which was the only port open in Europe in the 1940s, and is a preferred destination for millions of refugees. The USC provided help to artists, intellectuals, and dissidents escape the Nazis. Many refugees fled with the identification papers they needed to cross the borders, so the Lisbon office helped them obtain replacement papers. Joy believed these documents needed a seal, so he asked Hans Deutsch, an Austrian refugee artist working in Lisbon, to create one. It represented a chalice with a flame, the kind of chalice in which the Greeks and Romans put on their altars. It remotely suggests a cross, but that was not in his mind. The symbol of the Flaming Chalice first appeared on the title page of the 1976-1977 UUA directory. William Schultz is a Unitarian Universalist minister, spokesperson, activist, and author who primarily focus on the issues of human rights and U.S. government role in promoting or disregarding them. He received his doctorate of ministry at Meadville Lombard Theological School in 1975. William Schultz first served as minister at the First Parish Unitarian Church in Bedford, Massachusetts, from 1975 to 1978. In 1985, William Schultz became the next president of the UUA in Boston, Massachusetts, until 1993. While he was president of the UUA, in 1986, Schultz reformatted the Unitarian Universalist World from newspaper to a magazine format and renamed it UU World. In 1987, after communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, Schultz reconnected with the Unitarians of Transylvania and began forming church partnerships across extraordinary differences of culture and theology. A delegation traveled to Transylvania in 1990. In 1990, Schultz led a delegation to Transylvania to visit our fellow Unitarians in the ethnically Hungarian part of Romania, where the first Unitarian congregations were established almost 450 years ago. Part of a quote from William Schultz's editorial ended with, quote, "A concrete way to help rebuild religious freedom in Transylvania is by encouraging your congregation to become a sister church with one of the 130 Unitarian congregations in Transylvania," end quote. After 25 years later, since the partner church movement began, more than 160 U.S. and Canadian congregations had formed partnerships with 144 churches in Transylvania. 22 congregations have formed partnerships with more congregations in the Czech Republic, Hungary, India, the Philippines, Poland, and Uganda. These partnerships have enabled us to expand our understanding of not only global concerns, but it helps us understand our faith as well. Partners on both sides have developed a deeper appreciation of the inherent worth and dignity of all people, everywhere in the world. This has enriched our commitments to Unitarian Universalism and changed our understanding of ourselves, our fears, our goals, so that we can begin to think of ourselves as citizens of the world. Support for LGBT issues began with GAA resolution in 1970. A vote in 1974 established a denominational office to add programmatic support to lesbian, gay, and bisexual members. In 1987, the UA established a Common Vision Planning Committee, a diverse group of clergy and lay members around North American continent that was tasked with collecting the information about how welcomed and accepted gay, lesbian, and bisexual persons felt in their UU congregations. Although the UUA had been on record since 1970 as supporting the rights and worth of lesbian, gay, and bisexual persons, the lived experience of these people in UU congregations spoke a different, painful truth. The committee found that many still had deep prejudice and profound ignorance about bisexual, gay, and lesbian people, which resulted in their exclusion in UU congregations. In 1989, citing the UU principles, especially one that affirms the inherent worth and dignity of every person, the General Assembly voted to initiate the Welcoming Congregation Program, recommended by the Common Vision Planning Committee. A Welcoming Congregation Handbook was developed by Reverend Scott W. Alexander of the Directory of the Office of Lesbian and Gay Concerns, as well as with the help of many diverse contributors. This handbook brought together 10 workshops and other resources for helping congregations intentionally take steps to welcome people of all sexual orientations. Please join me for our next hymn, number 170, We Are a Gentle Angry People, by Holly Near, taken from words spoken by UUA President William Sinkford. William Schultz is also most known for his role as the executive director of Amnesty International USA from 1994 to 2006. While there, Amnesty International became increasingly interventionist in its policies and took more active roles in securing human rights protections encouraging collaboration with law enforcement and military force. William Schultz's writing emphasized the importance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as an embodiment of international conception of human rights. In 1992, G8 commits to the UUA becoming, quote, racially and culturally diverse, end quote. And in 1997, votes to become an, quote, anti-racist multicultural association. This was incorporated into governance, staff, and ministry training. The next and current hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition, was first published by the UUA in 1993. It was meant to be much more inclusive in gender references, multicultural sources, and a wider number of religious inspirations from Unitarians in Eastern Europe, spirituals from African American traditions, folk and popular tunes, music of major non-Christian religious traditions, chants and rounds gathered from various traditions of the world. After serving as CEO of Amnesty International, William Schultz became president of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee from 2010 to 2016. He then retired. During this time, he made numerous appearances as a guest on national radio and TV programs and testified before Congress concerning human rights issues. John A. Behrens was a graduate of Harvard Divinity School and was ordained in 1973. His first congregation that he served was in Knoxville, Tennessee, and then as the senior minister of the First Unitarian Church of Dallas in 1981. He then went on to be the co-minister of the Unitarian Church of All Souls in New York City. John Behrens was elected president of the UUA from 1993 to 2001. He received honorary doctorates from Stark King School of Ministry in 1990 and from Meadville Lombard Theological School in 1995. He engaged conversations with the Boy Scouts of America over issues of God and acceptance of bisexual, gay, lesbian, and transgender scouts and scout leaders. With the Unitarian Universalists becoming more involved in earth-centered worship and more members following paganism, the sixth source, the earth-centered traditions, was added in 1995. Spiritual teaching of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. From the Transcendentalists and Natural Humanists in the 1960s, some Unitarian Universalists also subscribed to following paganism. This term pagan comes from the Latin word for country dweller, first used in early Christian times to refer to those not yet converted to Christianity. Today, it refers generally to the faith of those whose spiritual center is drawn to native and natural religions, usually pantheistic or polytheistic, and almost always earth-centered. Many Unitarian Universalists find inspiration from the cycles of season and in the beauty of the natural world and in the relationships between humans and all other life on this planet. Some of us practice indigenous religions as well as modern paganism. Modern paganism is a modern, earth-centered religious perspective which borrows and adapts from pre-Christian paganism and contemporary religious thought. While reconnecting with ancient wisdom, it speaks to the needs and concerns of the present. You congregations welcome those who identify as pagans, including Wiccans and other practitioners of goddess spirituality, to our churches. Some congregations have modern pagan groups within them, such as chapters of CUPS, Covenant of UU Pagans. To celebrate our earth-based pagan friends, please join me in singing our next hymn, 1067, in Singing the Journey hymnal, Mother Earth, Beloved Garden. In 1999, the Buren's administration encouraged the UUA to work with the United Church of Christ to develop and introduce a new comprehensive sexuality curriculum called Our Whole Lives. The curriculum is a holistic and accurate approach to information about relationships and sexuality. This dismantles stereotypes and assumptions, builds self-esteem, fosters healthy relationships, improves decision-making, and has the potential to save lives. There are 6 curricula to cover participant needs by age group: grades K through 1, grades 4 through 6, grades 7 through 9, grades 10 through 12, young adults, and adults. Buren's recognized and realized that there was a need for Unitarian Universalist books that Beacon Press could not publish. So he helped create the Skinner House books to print those texts that were dedicated to the life and history of Unitarian Universalists. The Skinner House books are celebrating their 22nd anniversary this year. The beginning of Skinner House lacked conflict. Its concept was risky, and its success was not guaranteed. Today, it seems like that time has arrived, and it has become very successful. While still being a part of the UUA Publications Office, Skinner House remains a specifically UU press by and for UUs. It now publishes a really broad range of material promoting UU values in the broader world. The legacy of Skinner House is that it is connecting to congregations, and its imprints also retain an inward focus. William Sinkford graduated from Harvard University in 1968, where he was those in opposition to the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. In 1995, Sinkford received his Master's in Divinity from Starr King School for the Ministry. William G. Sinkford was UUA president from 2001 to 2009. His installment as UUA president made him the first African American to hold this office or in any traditionally white religious denomination in the United States. General Assembly endorsed marriage equality in 1996. UU congregations championed equal marriage rights across the country. William Sinkford spoke at a Marriage Act press conference in 2009. Here's a partial quote from that. Quote, UUs have welcomed loving Lgbt couples and their families in our congregations for decades, and since 1996 have formally called for legal civil marriages for these couples. We believe that all people, gay and straight, have an inherent worth and dignity. We believe that we are all children of God, and that all of us should be treated equally by our government, that no class or citizen should be singled out for discrimination. In the fall of 2003, then-President UUA William Sinkford appointed a task force to form the UU Musicians Network to create a new congregational hymn book. They were to look for music submissions that offered fresh hymns, chants, or other songs that would enliven worship, as well as collect music in various styles of music, including jazz, folk, pop, spirituals, gospel, praise songs, call and response, chants, rounds, and traditional hymns. They also wanted to include songs that were UU appropriate and representative of a variety of areas in our lives, such as the spirituality of the LGBT community, earth-centered, and the non-Western theologies, both male and female spirituality, and the music of cultures traditionally underrepresented in our communities. Singing the Journey made its debut at the 2005 UUA General Assembly in Fort Worth, Texas. The first printing of the book sold out within 3 weeks. In May 2008, ICE raided the Agri-Processors, Inc., a kosher slaughterhouse in Pottsville, Iowa. They deployed 900 agents and arrested 398 employees, the largest single raid of a workplace in U.S. history. Agents used the, quote, presumed race, ethnicity to identify suspected undocumented immigrants, allegedly handcuffing all employees assumed to be Latino until their immigration status was verified, end quote. The Supreme Court later ruled that undocumented workers could not be charged with aggravated identity theft unless it was established that they knew that they had used an authentic Social Security number, prompting calls by some immigration attorneys and some members of Congress to dismiss previous convictions against immigrants for aggravated identity theft, and consider dismissing the guilty pleas sought against the Postville workers. This raid received wide national publicity. Lawmakers and labor unions representatives criticized the Bush administration as disproportionately targeting workers instead of employers. Sinkford spoke out at an ICE raid speech in October 2008. Here's a partial quote from that speech. Quote, the first call for a moratorium on immigrations and customs enforcement raids. UUs took these positions because we believe our country's current treatment of undocumented workers conflicts not only with our faith's deepest religious principles, but also the basic goals of the USA. UU religious tradition celebrates the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and affirms the need for justice, equity, and compassion in human relation. The recent workplace raids by ICE are an affront to these values. Raids dehumanize immigrant workers and communities. ICE raids are the most glaring symptom of an immigration system that is fundamentally broken. We must remember that this great nation was built by immigrants, for immigrants. We must end the ICE raids now and draft comprehensive immigration reform. We Americans, whether we are citizens, residents with legal rights, or undocumented workers, we all must demand change. By calling for an immediate moratorium on ICE raids, we reject the injustice and cruelty of our current laws and take a key step toward compassionate and fair immigration reform. End quote. GA endorsed marriage equality in 1996. UU congregations continued to champion equal marriage rights across the country, even though it wasn't legal in the United States. William Sinkford spoke at a Marriage Act press conference in 2009. Here's a partial quote from that. Quote, UUs have welcomed loving LGBT couples and their families in our congregations for decades, since 1996, and have formally called for legal civil marriage for these couples. We believe that all people, gay and straight, have an inherent worth and dignity. We believe that we all are children of God and that all should be treated equally by our government. End quote. In 2009, UUA President Sinkford launched an advocacy campaign after the Knoxville shooting called Standing on the Side of Love, which started in response to the shooting at the Tennessee Valley Unitarian Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, when a man walked into the church's sanctuary during the performance of a children's musical and began firing a shotgun, killing 2 and injuring 6. The UUA had also used Standing on the Side of Love slogan for its marriage equality campaign. Reverend Jason Shelton, Associate Minister for the Music at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville, Tennessee, popularized the phrase when he wrote the song Standing on the Side of Love, which became the anthem for the UUA's marriage equality movement, as well as the immigration justice, racial equity, and intersectionality among our congregations and movements. It was a bold campaign of inclusivity, of acting out of this sense of love, of connecting with each other across differences of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. Through its Standing on the Side of Love campaign, the UUA supported and works for gaining LGBT rights and works of blacks and immigrants. Standing on the Side of Love has already been an effective message for Unitarian Universalists that is a primary point to our religious values. We want to build on that success and make the umbrella even bigger. Standing on the Side of Love is aimed at helping congregations gather support in their communities for marginalized groups, lobbying for same-sex marriage, calling for immigration reform, or protesting hate crimes and racism. The Reverend Peter Morales was the first Latino president of the UUA. He was elected as president in June 2009 and resigned in March 2017, serving almost 2 terms. Public witnesses, immigration reform, environmental justice were Morales' main passions. Prior to serving the UUA, he was a senior minister at Jefferson Unitarian Church in Golden, Colorado, one of the largest and fastest growing congregation in the country. UUA embraced immigration reform and immigration rights as key public witness priorities, promoted by Black Lives Matter. Morales launched a comprehensive review of UU ministry early in his presidency in order to make UU a multicultural faith, pointing to the growing number of ministers preparing for UU ministry who were people of color. In 2013, President Barack Obama passed Proposition 8 and struck down DOMA, making same-sex marriages legal in the United States. Standing on the Side of Love initiative is grounding in its religious values, said newly elected UUA President Peter Morales. Quote, "There's no difference between spiritual values and social action. They're 2 sides of the same coin. When we experience our connection with that which transcends us with other people, we become compassionate. We suffer with, not separated from another. That's deeply spiritual experience." Black Lives Matter began in 2013 after the man who shot and killed an unarmed black teenager, Trayvon Martin, was cleared of his murder. Alicia Garza, a California activist, responded to the jury's decision on Facebook with a post that ended, quote, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter," end quote. The hashtag was born and continued to grow in prominence with each new incident and protest. The slogan soon gained international recognition after the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, a year later. In 2015, the General Assembly passed a resolution to support the Black Lives Matter movement and Black-led racial justice organizations. They called the member congregations to respond to a call of action, to become closer with the communities, and to help prevent further incidents. It further resolved that congregations engaged in intentional learning about racial justice and the interconnected nature of racism, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability and language, and along with systematic oppression that impact people of class. In 2015, General Assembly encouraged member congregations and all Unitarian Universalists to work toward police reform, prison abolition, civil rights, equality, and to take the initiative in collaboration with local and national organizations to fight for racial justice. No matter who you are, Black Lives Matter, and a system of fair, transformative, and restorative justice that is accountable to communities is something to which each of us has a right. Unitarian Universalists and our greater society have the power to make this happen. Let's do it, a quote by President Morales. Standing on the Side of Love was a bold campaign of inclusivity, of acting out this sense of love, connecting to each other across differences of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. Yet there was another group within Unitarian Universalism who felt the song and campaign was not as inclusive as it could be. Those people were those who were fighting for disability rights and felt that the language of standing made those who were unable to stand invisible, and that standing equated to the ability to stand with power. So jumping ahead to 2018, Jason Shelton, who wrote the song, listened to these critics and decided to rewrite the lyrics to this song, changing the name to Answering the Call of Love, like you will hear today. Also in response to the same hurt, the Justice Campaign, based on the song Standing on the Side of Love, changed its name to simply Side with Love. Please join in singing the next hymn, 1014, Answering the Call of Love. This video was made and performed by Michael Tacy.
1, 2, 3, 4. Of the Spirit, faith, hope, and love abide, and so every soul is blessed and made whole. The truth in our hearts is our guide. We are answering the call of love. Hands joined together, as hearts beat as one.
Reverend Peter Morales wrote and spoke about the challenges and opportunities that we face in our congregation's faith and beyond in his essay titled Congregation and Beyond Initiative. He realized that we needed to make some changes in how we viewed ourselves, our congregations, and our faith. Morales stated that congregations cannot be the only way we connect with people. We need to see our faith as part of an international religious movement, instead of just an association of congregations. We needed to focus more on connection and less on memberships and how we pay attention to making a difference in the world. How many lives have we changed, or how have we affected people's lives can help us redirect our effort outward. Connecting with young adults, students, snowbirds, people living in foreign countries, and ethnic minorities, even though they do not choose to join a congregation, letting them know that they can also be a part of the UU movement without joining a congregation. The main idea for this essay was that our core values appeal to far more people than we are attracted to, or likely to join our congregations. We have always seen this as a problem to be solved by trying to find ways to get people to become members of our congregations. But in the reality of today's world, not everyone who shares our core values wants to become part of a traditional congregation. The fact that so many people share our values is an enormous opportunity, not a problem. The future of our faith will depend on whether we can create a religious movement beyond as well as within our congregations. Reverend Morales resigned in March of 2017 before his term was up in June. After the General Assembly, another president would be elected. It was determined that for the next 3 months, from March to June, 3 interim co-presidents would be appointed to cover the needs of the UUA. These individuals were Reverend Sophia Benecourt, whose work as a religious educator, parish minister, and seminary professor at the Star King School of Ministry, as well as her developed leadership qualities. She was appointed interim co-president of the UUA for the Commission on Institutional Change. Reverend William G. Sinkford previously served as UUA president from 2001 to 2009, was minister at the First Unitarian Church of Portland, and was appointed as interim co-president for the role of president, as outlined in the UUA bylaws. And Dr. Leon Spencer, a professor emeritus at the Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, Georgia, as well as a decades-long lay leader. In 1985, he helped establish the Black Concerns Working Group and has participated in the Jubilees Working Group, the Journey Towards Wholeness Transformation Team, and the Diverse Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries. He was appointed interim co-president of Constituent Outreach. After the resignation of Peter Morales in April 2017 at the June General Assembly in New Orleans, members of the Unitarian Universalist congregations elected the first women to hold office of UUA president. The delegates at the General Assembly elected Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray, who is a lifelong Unitarian Universalist and grew up attending Elliott Chapel Unitarian Church in Kirkwood, Missouri. Prior to her election, Susan had been the lead minister of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Phoenix, Arizona, where she was a national voice for immigration rights, playing a crucial role in the long-term campaign to end the constitutional violations of Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio. She received her bachelor in science degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she briefly worked in the field of genetic sequencing. Susan earned her ministerial degree from Harvard Divinity School, where she was a student minister at Winchester Unitarian Society and as an intern at the First UU Church of Nashville, Tennessee, and on the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Youngstown, Ohio. During the General Assembly in 2017, the delegates at the conference adopted a statement on escalating inequality, citing racism, poor health, and low literacy among the major factors. 2 days after her election, Frederick Gray, who led the Unitarian Universalist opposition to Arizona's strict immigration law that passed in 2010, issued a statement expressing disappointment in the Supreme Court's decision to allow portions of President Trump's travel ban to be enforced while the legal battle over it continues. Quote, "We believe that these restrictions are an example of religious discrimination because they target travelers from Muslim-majority countries. Our country should welcome people regardless of their religious affiliation or lack thereof." End quote. Resist and Rejoice was the official title of the 2017 GA, which focused on racial justice and commitment to dismantling white supremacy. There was an emphasis on encouraging more UUs of color to attend the 2017 GA. The Board of Trustees authorized using funds from the GA reserve for financial assistance to approximately 200 applicants. The UUA invited the 4,029 people who registered for GA to complete a survey about their racial and ethnic identity. Of the 2,660 who responded, 2,188 identified as white, non-Hispanic, or Latinx. 488 respondents identified as people of color, and 233 identified as Black. On Friday afternoon, over 1,000 Unitarian Universalists gathered in front of the Convention Center for the Parade of Love Resists, rejoicing for sanctuary and solidarity. As a heat wave was bearing down, these UU marchers followed the Young and Talented Brass Band along with the original Big 7 Social Aid and Pleasure Club through the city streets of New Orleans in a traditional second-line procession, carrying parasols and Love Resist signs. Yolanda Walter, the local site coordinator for GA, who has called New Orleans her home for 2 decades, describes herself as fully Black and fully UU. Led a spirited chant of Love Resists before the second-line procession, waving handkerchiefs and brandishing parasols, high-stepping through the streets to the sound of New Orleans jazz. The procession ended with a rally for social justice sponsored by the Center for Ethical Living and Social Justice Renewal, a UU social justice organization in New Orleans that was the local host of the organization for the General Assembly. Delegates at the 2017 GA passed several business resolutions. To amend the UUA second source so that it reads words and deeds of prophetic people instead of words and deeds of prophetic women and men, allowing inclusivity and affirmation of multitude genders. This change passed overwhelmingly, but will require another vote next year since it's changed in the bylaws. Another resolution was to change the first principle's affirmation of the inherent worth and dignity of every person to the inherent worth and dignity of every being. The Board of Trustees vowed to launch a new study commission to review any proposed changes to these principles. Delegates also passed a resolution urging the commission to consider adding an explicitly anti-racist 8th principle. The proposed wording for the 8th principle is, quote, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying toward spiritual wholeness by building a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that are accountable to dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions," end quote. Delegates at the GA also adopted a statement of conscience: escalation economic inequality. that proclaimed that challenging extreme inequality locally and globally is a moral imperative. It outlined individual, congregational, and denominational ways to respond. Another resolution passed urging the leaders of the UUA standing on the side of love, witness, campaign to consider a name change because of the use of the word standing places a high value on the justice work and commitments of able-bodied people, while it makes invisible and exclusive to those with wide-range disabilities and autistic people. It was changed to Side with Love. During the 2018 General Assembly in Kansas City, the UUA board brought several bylaw changes up to be voted on. Make all language in the bylaws gender neutral. A second vote on changing the wording on the second source to honor words and actions of prophetic people from words and actions of women and men. Advocates continued to have support for proposals to add an eighth principle, which would be to focus on anti-racism. The board not received a resolution to bring those changes to the GA agenda this year. During the business session at the 2018 General Assembly, delegates voted to make dismantling white supremacy its priority for congregational study and action this year, and adding an eighth principle to our principles and purposes. The eighth principle. In business sessions during the 2018 General Assembly, the UUA voted and passed amendments to make dismantling white supremacy its priority for congregational study and action this year. They endorsed 3 actions of immediate witness, which emphasize the urgency of supporting people of color and indigenous people. Attention was drawn to predatory medical fees charged to incarcerated people who are disproportionately people of color. The solidarity with indigenous water protectors who face federal charges for disrupting construction of liquid natural gas pipelines due to the Native American lands, and the demand of the immediate action to improve U.S. treatment of asylum seekers and migrant families to keep families together. They also called for the abolition of ICE, Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, and implementation of a system that understands the causes of migration and provides a human solution for asylum seekers while waiting for the decision on their immigration case. The proposal to change the second source from prophetic women and men to prophetic people overwhelmingly passed during this business session of the General Assembly 2018 as well. Although some delegates expressed sorrow at the loss of affirmation of women, they did affirm that people would also include women and those who may not identify as male or female. The delegates voted resoundingly in favor of changing all gendered pronouns using only the singular third person of they, them, and their in the UUA bylaws. The 2019 General Assembly was in Spokane, Washington, with the theme of the power of we. The Planning Committee and the Commission of Institutional Change invited UUs to engage in discernment about the future of the faith. Some questions that were asked of participants to discuss were, what from our faith traditions help guide your life? What's your personal commitment to transforming and living out our values and benefits? What sustains you and your faith community in efforts toward inclusion, equity, and diversity? What limits you from living out our faith's promise towards liberation and transformation? The 2019 General Assembly rallied with local activist groups against expansion of the Spokane jail and raised almost $40,000 for a community center. During the business meeting, delegates voted on proposed statement of conscience, drafted over the past 2 years, entitled Our Democracy Uncorrupted. They also voted on a series of proposed bylaws changes, including the UUA election processes and bylaws about ministerial fellowship committee. The 2019 General Assembly public witness event focused on ending mass incarceration, which was one of the UUA's 4 missional priorities. UU's rallied with local activist groups, which called on the Spokane County Board of Commissioners to abandon their plans to expand the Spokane County Jail and to press for restorative justice and other reforms. At this event, UU's worked alongside the Side of Love campaign and other local organizing community agencies such as Smart Justice Spokane, Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane, the local Spokane NAACP, the Spokane Community Against Racism, and the UU Church of Spokane, Washington. At the end of the Smart Justice rally, people formed a heart at Side with Love, UUAGA. The theme for the General Assembly in 2000 was Rooted, Inspired, and Ready. The General Assembly was supposed to be held in Providence, Rhode Island, but when COVID-19 pandemic hit, big changes needed to be made. And for the first time in history, the General Assembly was totally virtual. One still had to purchase tickets for the conference, but at a lower cost, and no one had to purchase airline tickets or hotel rooms to attend the virtual conference. There were almost 5,000 people registered to participate remotely from all around the world, which was record-breaking. Those who virtually attended GA 2020 spent time in workshops, worship services, and business meetings, which focused on calling for the solidarity with Indigenous communities, supporting the defending of police, and formalizing a human rights investment screen. Through the past 4 services, we have heard about Unitarians and Universalists and their movements throughout the centuries, as well as the people who have helped develop the denomination and faith that we have today. You can see how we went from a Christian-based denomination to one that was more secular through transcendentalism and humanism, to our modern-day UU faith in which we look to ourselves as well as other world religion sources for our spirituality. You heard and saw where our denomination and faith has fit into history, and how Unitarians and Universalists' view have changed throughout the years, and who pointed us into these directions. My hope is that you have gained a better knowledge of the people who have shaped Unitarianism and Universalism through the centuries, as well as helping you follow and develop your own spiritual path. To close our service, if you have a lit chalice or candle near you, please join me in our extinguishing chalice words. The light of truth and meaning cannot be put out. We are keepers of this flame until we meet again. I encourage everyone to be on the lookout for emails from the church office. They are the best way to keep up to date on announcements and updates at First Unitarian Church of Alton. You may also check our website, newsletter, and Facebook page. Please contact the church office if you have an event or announcement that you would like to share via our weekly Church This Week email. Next week, on June 20th, Chris Sutton will be our speaker. The title of his service is In the Name of the Father. The service will be on our YouTube channel at 10 o'clock. On June 27th, the worship service of the opening of the UUA General Assembly will be on Zoom at 11 o'clock. People are also invited to watch this service in person at church as well. COVID protocol will be in place by wearing masks and social distancing. Our closing words are by Louis Weichart and John Andrew Story. Our worship is done. Once more we face the task. The world awaits the service we must give, and this alone is all we dare to ask, that we might find courage how to live. Go in peace. Please listen to our postlude, number 121, We'll Build a Land, from the Kitsap Unitarian Universalist Church.
Peace.